There's a very interesting way to save on paying taxes, to potentially pay no taxes for a lot of people, and this is through the use of what are called non-dom programs. So today I'm going to share with you 4 places that you could move this year or in the future, taking advantage of the non-dom program. I'll explain what non-dom programs are in a second, and potentially paying no tax, or at least greatly reducing the tax that you are going to pay. So let's dive in and cover that. Now, the first thing really is, what does non-dom mean? And this is a very British concept. So most countries don't have the concept of domicile separate from residence. So you'll hear me talk a lot on this channel about residency programs. Residency is essentially where you live, okay? It's where you have a residency permit, maybe we have legal residency and tax residency, but generally it's where you live. Domicile is more like your home. So you may loosely think of this in terms of, for example, where you were born, right? Where you're from. It's not exactly that. It's like this very weird concept, because you can have something called domicile by choice, meaning that you could have been born someplace, you could move away, and you could choose to move your domicile to somewhere else. And the interesting thing is that if you claim that your domicile is somewhere else, it doesn't mean that the other country has any bearing on it at all, because they may not have any concept of domicile. So this is the first thing to understand, is that you can go and live in a country and hence be a resident there, but in certain countries, the 4 countries I'm going to talk about in a second, you can consider yourself non-dom there. Now, usually there's some sort of a time limit associated with this. We're going to talk a little bit about those limits in a second. And so after a while, they don't allow you to consider yourself non-dom, or in some cases, maybe if you get the citizenship, then you can't be considered non-dom, etc. But this being said, it's pretty good if you can, because there's typically special tax treatment for it. So what are those 4 countries? So the first country, the most famous one, is the place where this whole concept originates, and this is, of course, UK. Now, interestingly, the concept of the UK non-dom program actually goes back to the time of like the French Revolution, so a pretty long time that they've had this non-dom program in place. And what the non-dom program in UK allows you to do is benefit from what's called remittance-based tax. What is remittance-based tax? Remittance-based tax is when only the money that is brought into the country is taxable. Now, it's slightly more complicated than that, because this is for basically passive income. Earned income, you're going to be in a situation where it's fully taxable. Okay, so if you're sitting in UK and you're doing work, they're going to say income that is arising from UK is going to be taxable. However, if you have investments that are located abroad, if you have a company that's located abroad that's paying out dividends, if you have maybe real estate from abroad, maybe you have bonds or something that are paying interest, etc., all of these things can be received, and if they're not brought into UK, meaning not into a UK bank account and not spent in the UK, there's also a few other little nuances. Like, for example, if you were to use those foreign assets to collateralize a loan, then generally that loan would be considered to be located in UK. But this being said, there are once in a while some tricky ways that you can maybe in certain cases get around it, but for the most part the strategy is you bring what money you want into the country with you when you first move there. You then keep most of your wealth outside of the country. You make it so that that wealth produces wealth for you. You receive that money into a foreign bank account. You just keep reinvesting it, you keep growing it. You pay no tax on any of that, unless you bring it into UK, in which case, yes, then you will get taxed on it. Okay, so that's the first interesting thing. And I'm going to talk in a second about some of the benefits that come from this remittance system versus some other options, because people may have questions about that. What's the next country? The next country that we get to deal with is the nearby neighbor, who is Ireland. And the Irish program actually is slightly better than the UK program, and it functions in more or less the same way. Ireland is a weird country. They have this concept of residence, then they have ordinary residence, then they have domicile, and so you can have various combinations of being resident, ordinary resident, and domiciled. And this is a place where clearly you can have domicile by choice. So you actually have to choose to remove your domicile if you're moving away from there and you have previously been domiciled. This being said, for people who are moving there, it can be really great. Same concept applies that I was mentioning before, right? You can have foreign assets. Those foreign assets can produce income for you. You can then receive that income into a foreign bank account, and that can be received tax-free. Obviously, if you're sitting in Ireland working, again, you're going to end up in a situation where you're fully taxable. That's not going to be something that you can do much about. And if you're in a situation where you bring the money in, you want to buy a house, you want to buy a car, you want to whatever, then you'll be taxable on that as well. However, The advantage of Ireland versus UK are the limits. So it's after a certain number of years in UK, they start taxing with a flat tax, and the flat tax goes up a number of years after that. So you end up in a situation where it's okay, like if you're making enough money, if you're like a really huge income earner, it could be worth it regardless. But this being said, it's mainly for the first 7 or so years that it becomes useful. And then after that, you start to face some other situations where they start to say, okay, well, we're going to hit you with a base flat tax every year, and then after a few more years, they raise it again. Ireland doesn't have that. It's easier to maintain non-dom status if you are somebody who is moving to Ireland than if you're somebody who's moving to UK. But this being said, they both have the status. This brings us to our third country. What would you imagine as the third country? It is certainly one of the more British countries also in Europe, which is Malta. Malta has a non-dom program that is pretty flexible. They can allow you to maintain it in many situations where you wouldn't be able to in some of these other countries, as I was kind of mentioning. And here you have some added benefits because income from capital can actually be brought into the country. You can remit it. So it's essentially what would be considered business income is, if not remitted into Malta, not taxable. And if you're bringing in income from capital, it is taxable. Now, there are some circumstances under which you actually can be hit with a minimum tax. The minimum tax is not that high, but you can end up having to pay that. So there are some trade-offs with Malta, as well as, of course, there's trade-offs in terms of lifestyle. We've done some videos previously where I was in Malta recently, and so you can go and check those out where I talked about it a little bit. So that's Malta as the third country. The fourth country that we might look at is Cyprus. And Cyprus has, I've often said, the best tax regime in the EU for a lot of people. They have very favorable treatment, and in particular, the non-dom status is easy to get. It's easy to maintain for a period of 17 years, which is pretty long. And under it, it's not actually a remittance-based system, so this is part of why it's a little bit more favorable. However, they don't tax dividends. They don't tax capital gains in general from the sale of shares, etc. Yeah, if you have real estate in Cyprus, you'll get taxed, but that's not likely to be a big part of your income. Certainly, if you're earning income inside the country, yes, you'll be taxable. However, it's much more possible to optimize your tax within the country, and so this is sort of your fourth option. So there are some other countries that have systems that would be considered by some people to be a non-dom regime. Some people will call the Portuguese non-habitual residency regime a non-dom. Technically, it's not officially considered in the same way. You can also look at a country like Italy, where they have their flat tax regime. Again, not officially a non-dom regime. Similar thing with Greece, not officially a non-dom regime. However, these are similar sort of programs. You may also consider some of the programs that exist in places like Latin America, the Caribbean, to fall under sort of a similar category. Now, the question becomes, why is this so good, right? Because there's a couple different alternatives you might run into. One such alternative would be, okay, well, I set up a company, and the company has its operations abroad, it has its management and control abroad, maybe it's managing my investments, and if things are set up properly, and if I'm in a situation where I'm not in a country that's going to cause me issues, because there's certainly lots of different rules that could get you into trouble, you could end up in a situation where you don't pay tax on that company and then you just leave the money in the company, right? How is leaving the money in the company any different from having this remittance basis where the money comes into your personal name, but the money is outside the country and you really can't use it for any local spending? What is the advantage here? Well, there's two different advantages. One is, as you travel, you could spend the money outside the country. So that's the first thing that's kind of appealing, is you do have access to it. Now, granted, from a company standpoint, you could often write off expenses for travel anyway, so there's some debatable benefit. The other advantage, which I think is the more reasonable advantage, is non-dom programs are typically designed for somebody who's going to move to a country for a period of time, live there for a number of years, and then leave. And why this is advantageous is, let's just say you did this same process with the company, right? So even if we're talking about UK, you could have a situation where you have a UK holding company. The UK holding company has some foreign assets. Those foreign assets are in foreign companies. They're able to remit the dividends tax-free to the UK company. Great, you're in a situation where this seems positive, right? Why wouldn't you want that? And so wonderful, you know, at the end you just leave the country and you pay out the dividends, right? Well, no, that's where you get into trouble, because very often, I mean, there's certain cases, clearly if you were to go to Dubai or you were to go to some country like that where you can receive the dividends tax-free, yes, but let's just say you went from UK to the US, right? Now you pay out the dividends, well, now you're hit with UK, or with US, taxes. That's not good. Whereas by contrast, because the assets are already in your personal name, if you move to UK, you were under the non-dom, let's say you're there for 5-6 years, you are compounding your wealth, you're growing your investments, etc. You leave UK and you move to the US, all that money that you take with you that was in your personal name is already money that you've earned, and therefore it's coming with you tax-free. You don't have to pay a tax when you go. So this is like the big advantage of a remittance-based system over using some sort of a deferral strategy through a company. I'm not saying that the deferral strategy can't be good. It can be in certain situations. Trusts also can help you in certain situations. But if you can get away with it, the remittance-based system is kind of more appealing because of the fact that you can benefit from taking the money in your personal name immediately. The last benefit, which I think is really worth noting, is that very often those companies will be subject to the Controlled Foreign Companies Rules, the CFC Rules, as well as things like management and control rules, etc. In other words, let's just say I'm going and setting up a company, and it's a holding company in Singapore, and the holding company in Singapore is managing my assets for me, right? So it's going and it's investing the money, it's buying stocks, bonds, you know, whatever it's buying, right? Various different investments. And maybe those are not taxable in Singapore. Singapore happens not to tax capital gains, for example. However, that company is going to be subject to UK's management control rules. So if you're managing and controlling it from UK, that company is going to be fully taxable in the UK. It's also going to be subject to the CFC rules, so potentially it's going to get caught under those rules. Whereas by contrast, if the assets are in your personal name, and you're going and you could be managing them abroad from UK under the non-dom system, and so long as you're not remitting them, you don't pay any tax. So this is like a really nice way to go if you can take advantage of it. And so if you're interested in strategies like that, in how to optimize, whether you're looking at a non-dom program somewhere or a tax strategy somewhere else, you're figuring out where to move, what to do best, please reach out to us. You can book a call with me, calendly.com/Michael-Rosberg. There's a link in the description below. And I will look forward to seeing you guys on the next video.